Alara was 26 years old when the world she knew was dismantled, not with a bang, but with the dry rustle of legal papers. Her grandfather had been gone for a year in which the silence of his workshop had grown into a presence as solid as the granite foundations he had once laid. He had been a man of stone and water, a master mason who had helped build the great locks and aqueducts of a bygone era. From him, she had not inherited land or money, but something far more elemental, the quiet competence of her own two hands. He had taught her the language of stone, the geometry of a true arch, the patience of mortar, and the unwavering honesty of a plumb line. Her inheritance was contained in a worn leather tool roll, but its heart was a single object she kept in her pocket, a brass plumb bob, heavy and dense, shaped like an inverted teardrop. Its surface was a geography of tiny nicks and scratches, each a memory of a wall set true, or a pier sunk deep. It had been her grandfather's own, his final gift. When she held it, its cool weight was a comfort, a connection to the silent, steadfast man who believed that the world could be set right, one perfectly vertical line at a time. It was her compass and her conscience, a small, solid piece of truth in a world that was rapidly becoming unstable. The instability arrived in the form of her Uncle Marcus, her mother's brother, a man who saw the world not in lines of stone, but in columns of figures. He arrived on a Tuesday, his car a sleek, black intrusion against the wild tangle of her grandfather's garden. He did not come for tea or condolences. He came with a briefcase. Inside was the deed to the house, now legally his, and a contract of sale. "It's done, Alara," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion save a faint impatience. He stood in the middle of the living room, refusing to sit, as if the worn furniture might stain his suit. "The buyers are a development company. They want to clear the lot. You have until Sunday." She did not cry. She did not plead. The lessons of stone were lessons in bearing weight without complaint. She simply nodded, her gaze fixed on a point over his shoulder, where a shaft of afternoon light illuminated dust motes dancing in the air. Marcus seemed relieved by her lack of resistance. He pulled a thin white envelope from his jacket pocket and placed it on the mantelpiece, next to a photograph of her grandfather. "This is for you," he said. "A final settlement, to help you get started somewhere else." He made it sound like a kindness, but the gesture was as cold and administrative as the rest of it. He left without another word, the sound of his car's engine fading into the afternoon, leaving a silence deeper than the one that had preceded him. She waited until the sun had set before she picked up the envelope. Inside were $500 in crisp, impersonal bills. It was an insult dressed as charity, the final closing of a ledger she never knew was being kept. The price of a life, of a home, of every stone her grandfather had set with his own hands. $500. On Saturday, she packed. It did not take long. She had her grandfather's tools, a few changes of clothes, a small cast-iron skillet, and a tinderbox. Everything fit into a single canvas satchel. She tucked the plumb bob into the deep pocket of her canvas trousers. As she stood in the doorway for the last time, she looked back not at the house, but at the massive stone hearth that was its heart. Her grandfather had built it from river rock, each stone chosen and placed with an artist's eye. It would be rubble by next week. She closed the door softly behind her and did not look back. She walked. She had no destination in mind, only a direction, away. She followed the ghost of the old North Canal, its towpath a faint green scar on the landscape. This was her grandfather's country. He had worked this line for 40 years, and she felt his presence not as a haunting, but as a quiet encouragement in the rustle of the reeds and the solid feel of the earth beneath her boots. For 3 days she walked, eating sparingly from her pack and sleeping rolled in a blanket under the vast, indifferent canopy of stars. The journey stripped away the last of her grief, leaving behind a hard, clean resolve. She was adrift, but she was not lost. On the fourth day, the towpath led her to a small, forgotten town, huddled in a crook of the desiccated canal. A faded sign read, Lockhaven. It was a place that seemed to be actively surrendering to the slow forces of decay. Many of the buildings were shuttered, their windows like vacant eyes. She was low on supplies and entered the town's only general store, a place that smelled of dust, dried beans, and old paper. It was there, while waiting for the proprietor to weigh out a bag of oats, that she overheard a conversation between two old men leaning against the counter. They were talking about the county tax auction. "They'll never sell the old Croft place," one said, spitting a stream of tobacco juice into a brass spittoon. "Folly and ruin, that's all it is. Lock 17. House is a pile of rocks, and the old barge is still sitting in the bottom of the lock, right where it sank." "Dead man's folly," the other chuckled. "Silas Croft's ghost probably still haunts the place. Died broken alone, they say. 110 years that barge has been there. Cursed property." "What are they asking for it?" Ilara asked, her voice quiet but clear. The men turned, surprised. They looked her up and down, taking in her worn clothes and the satchel on her back. The first man grunted. $300 for the back taxes. $300 for a pile of rubble and a ghost story. A flicker of something, not hope, but a grim, defiant purpose, ignited in Ilara's chest. A pile of rocks. She knew about rocks. She paid for her oats and walked to the county clerk's office, a small, musty room in the back of the town hall. The clerk was a man named Gable, with a thin mustache and an air of perpetual boredom. When Ilara stated her purpose, he looked at her with undisguised pity. "Ma'am, you don't want that property. The lockkeeper's house is a shell. The lock itself is silted solid. The land is useless. It's a ruin." "I'm aware of its reputation," she said calmly. "I'd like to purchase the deed." Gable sighed, a long, theatrical exhalation of weary bureaucracy. He clearly saw her as a fool, another transient with more dreams than sense. He retrieved a dusty file and filled out the paperwork with a slow, deliberate hand, as if giving her one last chance to change her mind. She counted out $300 from her uncle's envelope. The bills lay on the polished wood of the counter, a tiny pyre of her old life. Gable stamped the deed with a heavy, final thud and slid it across to her, a faint, mocking smile playing on his lips. "Congratulations, miss. You're the proud owner of Dead Man's Folly." The walk to Lock 17 took another hour, following the canal as it cut deeper into the rugged hill country. The air grew stiller, the silence broken only by the buzz of insects and the cry of a distant hawk. Then she saw it, and her heart, which had been so steady, sank. Gable had not exaggerated. It was worse than she had imagined. The lockkeeper's house was a skeleton of granite walls, open to the sky. The roof was entirely gone, its timbers scattered and rotting on the ground. The windows were empty sockets staring into nothing. Below it, the great stone chamber of the lock was a swamp of stagnant, green water and choked reeds. And there, tilted at a drunken angle, was the black, hulking shape of the supply barge, its tarred hull half submerged in the silt and mud of a century. It looked like the ribcage of some great, fallen beast. For a long moment, despair was a physical weight on her shoulders. The mockery in Gable's eyes seemed to echo in the desolate silence. She had traded the last of her money for a tombstone. She slid down to sit on a dry patch of earth, the deed clutched in her hand, and felt the sharp edge of loneliness press in on her. But then her fingers brushed against the familiar weight in her pocket. She pulled out the brass plumb bob. She let it hang from its string, its point quivering for a moment before settling into a perfect, unwavering vertical. It pointed directly at the earth, a line of pure, unassailable truth. Her grandfather's voice seemed to whisper in her memory. "Find the foundation, Ilara. The rest is just weather." She stood up. The despair receded, replaced by the familiar calm of assessment. The house was a ruin, yes, But the foundation stones were massive, square-cut granite blocks. The walls, where they still stood, were a testament to incredible skill. This was not the work of a common laborer. This was the work of a master. She ran her hand over the cool, rough stone. It felt like a handshake across a century. The most immediate need was shelter. The main floor of the house was impossible, but a set of stone steps led down to what must have been a cellar. The entrance was choked with rubble and tangled vines, but after an hour of hard work, she cleared a path. The air that rose from the opening was cool and smelled of damp earth and stone dust. She lit a candle and descended. The cellar was miraculously intact. The thick stone walls had held. The ceiling, formed by massive, arched stone vaults, was sound. It was dark and damp, but it was 4 solid walls and a roof. This would be her first home. She spent the rest of the day clearing it out, sweeping away the debris of 100 years. It was hard, filthy work, but with every shovelful of dirt, she felt a sense of ownership, of purpose, taking root in her soul. That night, she built a small fire in the lee of one of the cellar walls. As the flames danced, casting flickering shadows on the ancient stones, she felt a profound sense of peace settle over her. She was alone. She was nearly penniless, and her home was a ruin, but it was her ruin. Over the next few days, she established a routine. Mornings were for exploring and assessing the property. Afternoons were for the hard labor of clearing debris from the house above. She began to notice the details of the construction. The joinery of the stones was impossibly tight, the mortar lines thin and precise. Silas Croft, the man who had built this place, had been no fool. He had been an artist. It was during the cleaning of the cellar that she found it. She was clearing the last corner, a space piled high with rotted timbers and silt from a long-ago flood. As she pried up a section of decayed flooring, her shovel scraped against stone. She cleared the dirt away and saw a floor of massive flagstones. They were all perfectly fitted, except for one. In the far corner, one of the stones was of a slightly different color, its mortar joint finer than the others. It was a subtle difference, one that 99 people out of 100 would have missed. But her grandfather had taught her to read stone like a book. She knelt, her heart starting to beat a little faster. She ran her fingers over the seam. It was almost invisible. She tapped the center of the stone with the handle of her hammer. The sound was different, not the solid thud of the others, but a faint, hollow thump. She remembered her grandfather's words. "Stone tells the truth, if you know how to listen." Her hands trembled slightly as she took a small pry bar from her tool roll. She worked carefully, chipping away the fine mortar line. It came away easily, like dry dust. The stone had not been set to be permanent. It had been set to be opened. After 10 minutes of painstaking work, she was able to get the tip of the bar under the edge. She put her weight on it, and with a low groan of protest, the massive stone tilted upwards, revealing a dark, square cavity beneath. The air that rose from the hole was dry and still, carrying the faint, metallic scent of old iron and the papery smell of aged leather. She lowered her candle into the opening. The light fell upon a heavy, iron-strapped box. It was not large, but it was clearly heavy. It took all her strength to lever it out of the hole and drag it across the cellar floor. The lock was rusted solid, but the hinges were weak. Using the pry bar, she forced the lid open with a screech of tortured metal. She stared, her breath catching in her throat. The box was filled to the brim with gold coins. They glowed with a soft, buttery light in the flickering candlelight. Coins minted with the faces of forgotten presidents and eagles with outstretched wings. It was a fortune, a king's ransom. But beneath the top layer of coins, there was something else. She carefully lifted out a handful of gold and uncovered an oilcloth-wrapped parcel. She unwrapped it with reverent fingers. Inside was a thick, leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with a sloping, elegant script. The ink was faded but perfectly legible. The first page read, "The Account and Testament of Silas Croft, Lockkeeper, Mason, Year of our Lord, 1878. For the rest of the night, sitting by her small fire, Alara read. She forgot her hunger, her weariness, her solitude. The voice of Silas Croft reached across 110 years and spoke directly to her heart. He had been a master stonemason, like her grandfather. He had built his fortune working on the very canal that now lay dead outside her door. He wrote of his pride in his work, of the beauty of a perfectly set keystone, of the music of a hammer on good steel. Then the tone of the journal darkened. He wrote of a betrayal. A partner in a Philadelphia firm had swindled him, stealing his life savings and leaving him with nothing but his tools and his name. Ruined and disgraced, Silas had retreated here, to Lock 17, the last project he had been contracted to build. He had poured all his remaining skill and passion into this small house, making it a fortress of stone and solitude. The gold in the box was the last of his personal wealth, which he had managed to salvage before his partner absconded. He had hidden it here, trusting the stone more than any bank. He wrote of the barge, the promise. It had been his final hope. He had used his last funds to purchase it and load it with the finest tools, milled lumber, and supplies. His plan was to wait for the spring thaw and take the barge west, to start a new life in the untamed territories. But a freak winter storm, a sudden thaw followed by a flash flood, had broken the upper dam. A wall of water had surged down the canal, ripping the promise from its moorings and sinking it in the very lock he had built to protect it. It was the final, cruel blow of fate. He had lost everything. He had lived on here for another 20 years, a recluse, a ghost in his own stone house. The last entry was dated 1898. His handwriting was shaky, but the words were clear. This house is my only child. This stone is my only legacy. I do not know who will find this, but it will be one who understands stone, for no other would see the seam. The gold is a curse to me, but it may be a blessing to another. It is a foundation. Use it to build what betrayal tore down. The barge is in the water, its cargo lost to me, but perhaps not forever. Let this house be a home again. Let there be fire in the hearth and light in the windows. That is all the testament I require. Be true. Be steady. Trust the stone. Tears streamed down Alara's face, the first she had shed since her grandfather's death. They were not tears of sadness, but of a profound, aching gratitude. She was not alone here. The ghost of Silas Croft was not a specter to be feared, but a kindred spirit. His story was her story. His loss was her loss. His blessing was her purpose. She gently closed the ledger. The weight of the gold was nothing compared to the weight of his words. The next morning, the world looked different. The ruin was no longer a symbol of despair, but a canvas of possibility. The sunken barge was not a tomb, but a mystery. The gold was not just money, it was a tool, the most powerful one she now possessed. Her first act was a pilgrimage back to Lockhaven. She walked into the general store, her clothes still dusty, but her bearing changed. Maeve, the woman who ran the store, a practical matriarch with kind eyes, watched her approach. Alara laid one of the gold coins on the counter. It was a $20 double eagle, glowing with the weight of history. Maeve's eyes widened, but she showed no surprise, only a quiet curiosity. "I need to open a line of credit," Alara said. "I'll be needing lumber, lime for mortar, roofing slate, tools, rope, a great deal of rope." Maeve picked up the coin, feeling its milled edge. She looked at Alara, not at the gold. She saw the new light in the young woman's eyes, the steel in her spine. She nodded slowly. "I reckon you will," she said. "Where should I have the first load delivered?" "Lock 17, Alara said. "The old Croft place." News of the deliveries to the ruin spread through Lockhaven like wildfire. It became the town's primary source of gossip and speculation. Gable, the county clerk, was openly scornful. "A fool and her money," he was heard to say at the post office. "She'll give up when the first snow flies." But Alara did not give up. The work became her entire world. She lived by the sun and the seasons. She started with the walls of the house, methodically clearing the fallen stones. Each one she cleaned and assessed, setting aside the sound ones for rebuilding. She mixed her own mortar, using the method Silas had described in his journal, a slow, patient process that resulted in a bond stronger than modern cement. She worked with a quiet, rhythmic intensity that was a form of meditation. Hammer and chisel, trowel and line, the simple, honest tools of her trade. Her steady labor did not go unnoticed. One afternoon, a stooped figure appeared on the towpath. It was Elias Vance, the town blacksmith. He was a man made of iron and soot, with a reputation for being as taciturn as the anvil he hammered on. He watched her for nearly an hour, his arms crossed, his expression unreadable. She was hoisting a heavy lintel stone into place over a window frame, using a system of simple levers and rollers. It was a job for 3 men, and she was doing it alone. Finally, he spoke, his voice a low rumble. "Your grandfather's chisels?" he asked, nodding at the tools laid out on a nearby stone. Alara, startled, just nodded. "The temper is going," he said. It was not a criticism, but a diagnosis. "The edges are soft. Bring them to my shop. Good steel deserves a proper fire." He turned and walked away without waiting for a reply. The following evening, she took the tool roll to his forge. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot metal. Elias took the tools without a word, examining each one with a master's eye. He lit the forge, and as the coals began to glow, he spoke. "Folks say you're a fool, wasting good money on a pile of cursed rocks." "They're good rocks," Alara said simply. A flicker of something that might have been a smile touched the blacksmith's lips. He took up his hammer. "Aye," he said, as he plunged the first chisel into the heart of the fire. "That they are." He would not accept payment for the work, dismissing her attempts with a wave of his hand. "A good mason deserves good tools," was all he would say. It was a mark of respect, a bond forged in the shared language of craft. Her second ally came in the form of Caleb, an old trapper who lived in the hills beyond the canal. He knew the land and its history better than anyone. He would often appear at the edge of her clearing, silent as a shadow, to watch her work. One day he brought her a freshly dressed rabbit and a handful of wild herbs. "Silas Croft would be proud," Caleb said, his voice like the rustle of dry leaves. "He was a good man. The canal company cheated him. This town forgot him. It's good to see a light here again." He became her historian, telling her the old stories, pointing out the best places to quarry slate and the strongest stands of oak for timber. With the walls of the house rising, true and strong, under her patient hands, she turned her attention to the roof. This was a task beyond her solitary ability. She needed help raising the great king trusses. She went to Elias. He listened to her plan, studied the drawings she had made based on the original roof line, and nodded. "I'll help," he said. "And I know a couple of others who will too." The day of the roof raising was a turning point. Elias arrived with 2 strong young men from the town, loggers who were skeptical at first, but were soon won over by the precision of Alara's joinery. Maeve came from the store with a basket of food and drink. Caleb was there, watching from his usual spot. Together they worked, a small, unlikely team, their efforts punctuated by the rhythmic calls of the men and the scrape of rope on wood. As they were hoisting the final truss into place, a figure appeared on the towpath. It was Gable, the clerk, his face a mask of disbelief. He had clearly come to witness her failure, to confirm his own cynical judgment. Instead, he saw a community. He saw the walls of the ruined house standing proud, a new skeleton of timber reaching for the sky. He saw Alara, directing the work with a quiet authority, her face smudged with dirt but shining with purpose. He saw the respect in the eyes of the men who worked alongside her. He stood for a moment, his mouth slightly agape, then turned and walked away, his smug certainty shattered. No one said a word, but a silent victory had been won. By the time the first snows of winter fell, the house was sealed. It had a roof, windows, and a heavy oak door that Elias had hung for her. The inside was still Spartan, but the great stone hearth, the first thing she had repaired, drew air perfectly. That first night, with a blizzard raging outside, she sat before a roaring fire in the house that Silas Croft had built, and that she had reclaimed. The wind howled around the stone walls, but inside it was warm and safe. She had built more than a house. She had built a home. Spring arrived with a torrent of melting snow. The canal, usually a sluggish trickle, swelled into a muddy, churning river. For 2 days, a relentless, warm rain fell, and the water rose to a level no one had seen in 50 years. The old, silted-up channel of Loch 17 was now a raging bottleneck. The water backed up, threatening to breach the towpath and flood the low-lying parts of Lockhaven downstream. A panic began to grip the town. A small delegation, led by Elias, made their way to her house. "The pressure on the bank is too great," he said, his face grim. "If it gives way, the town will be half drowned. We need to relieve it." Alara looked at the churning brown water straining against the earth. And then she looked at the massive, stone-lined lock. It was a dam, but it was also a gate. She remembered Silas's journal. He had written detailed notes about the lock's mechanics, the system of gears and sluices he had designed to control the flow of a mighty canal. "The sluice gates," she said, more to herself than to them. "If we can open them, we can divert the main flow down the old spillway channel. It will bypass the town." "They've been rusted shut for a century," one of the men protested. "And they're 20 feet under that water." "But I know where the winch house is," she replied, her mind racing. "And I know how the mechanism works." She led them to a small, almost buried stone structure on the far side of the lock. It housed the massive iron gears for the gates. They were rusted and stiff, but they were not broken. Silas Croft had built them to last. For hours they worked, using chains, levers, and all of Elias's strength and ingenuity. They packed the gears with grease and slowly, painstakingly, began to turn the great wheel. It groaned and screamed in protest. The strain was immense. Finally, with a shudder that they felt through the soles of their boots, something deep underwater gave way. A huge vortex began to form in the center of the lock chamber as the main sluice gate cracked open. A torrent of water began to pour into the spillway. They kept turning, and the flow increased, a controlled, thundering release of pressure. They watched as the water level in the main canal began to drop, inch by agonizing inch. By nightfall, the danger to the town had passed. They had done it. In the exhausted silence that followed, they stood on the edge of the lock. The flood had done more than just save the town. The incredible force of the water passing through the chamber had acted like a giant hydraulic jet, scouring away a century of silt and mud. And there, resting on the stone floor of the now drained lock, was the promise. Its hull was intact, preserved by the cold, oxygen-poor mud. The main cargo hatch was still sealed. Over the next week, the people of Lockhaven, the same people who had once called her a fool, came to help. They built a ramp and, with a complex system of blocks and tackles, hauled the ancient barge out of the lock and onto the bank. When Alara finally broke the seal on the cargo hold, a collective gasp went through the small crowd. It was a time capsule. Crates of pristine 19th century tools, axes, adzes, saws, planes, each wrapped in oilcloth and still bearing a razor-sharp edge. There were stacks of milled white pine and oak, barrels of nails, and boxes of hardware. And in a heavy sea chest, they found Silas's personal belongings, books, a set of drafting tools, clothes, and a small, exquisitely carved wooden bird, polished smooth by a thumb that had long since turned to dust. It was a treasure far greater than the gold. It was a legacy of craft, of hope, of a life that was meant to be. A year passed. The lockkeeper's house stood as if it had never been a ruin. Its stone walls glowed in the evening sun, and smoke curled from its chimney. The gardens were replanted, and the outbuildings were restored. The great barge, the Promise, had been carefully preserved and now rested beside the lock, a monument to its builder. The house itself had become something more than a home. Alara, using the proceeds from the sale of a few of the gold coins and the invaluable materials from the barge, had established it as a working museum and a center for heritage crafts. She taught children from the town the skills her grandfather and Silas had passed on to her: how to read the grain of wood, how to shape stone, how to forge iron with Elias in his shop. She was no longer the outcast, the solitary woman in the ruin. She was the heart of Lockhaven, the quiet steward of its history, and the architect of its future. She had found her community, not through words or social graces, but through the shared language of honest work and mutual respect. One evening, she stood on her porch, watching the last light fade from the sky. The house was quiet. On the mantelpiece over the great stone hearth, two objects sat side by side. One was her grandfather's brass plumb bob, its surface polished to a warm gleam. The other was the small wooden bird from Silas Croft's sea chest. They were her two inheritances, one of skill, the other of purpose. They were the anchors of her life. She thought of the journey that had brought her here, the cold dismissal of her uncle, the lonely walk along the dead canal, the purchase that everyone had called a folly. Her true inheritance had not been the insulting envelope of cash, but the strength in her hands and the knowledge in her heart. The world had taken everything from her, and in doing so, had given her everything that mattered. The $300 she had paid for this pile of rocks, for this ghost story, for this home, was, without a single doubt, the best money she had ever spent.